But first, I would like to introduce Professor Christoph Neuberger. We're very, very proud to have him here with us this afternoon. He is a professor of communication science at the Freie Universität in Berlin and the executive director of the Weizenbaum Institute for the Networked Society. He is also a member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities and of acatech, which is the German Academy of Science and Engineering. His work focuses on the digital transformation of media and journalism. Now, Professor Neuberger will raise a couple of really important questions this afternoon about the public's trust in online mediated journalism and news. Traditional news media are losing their positions as accountable gatekeepers, for instance, in terms of checking the accuracy of news. So how are journalists and news organizations dealing with profound attacks on their trustworthiness and their authority? We're very much looking forward to Professor Neuberger's reflections on the changing media landscape. And Professor Neuberger, the screen is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction, José, and also for the invitation to give a keynote speech at the conference. This is really a great honor for me. I hope you can see the first slide of my presentation and you can hear me well. It's still a strange situation. Even after 1 year, you sit alone at home in front of your screen and give a talk. When I look out of the window, I see the snow falling. Okay, let's start. The topic of my presentation, as you can see on the first slide, is the digital transformation of the knowledge order. In the last years, we heard many crisis diagnoses related to knowledge, truth, and trust in liberal democracies. When we look around, we can find a lot of symptoms of such a crisis. There's a strong public awareness of it, a strong sense of crisis. Now I have a problem with my presentation. Okay, now here's a small selection of newspaper and magazine headlines. The New York Times announced already in 2016 the age of post-truth politics and the age of distrust. The New Yorker headlined, "After the fact, in the history of truth, a new chapter begins." And Scientific American asked how to convince someone when facts fail and added this wonderful cartoon as an illustration. And there are many more examples, as you know. There's also a growing number of books dealing with this topic, to name just a few titles. The Death of Truth from Michiko Kakutani, The Death of Expertise, a book written by Tom Nichols, The Disinformation Age, a volume edited by Lance Bennett and Stephen Livingston, or The Internet of Us, Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data, a book of philosopher Michael Patrick Lynch. Another symptom of this knowledge crisis is the fear of disinformation, of fake news and conspiracy theories in the population. What you can see here are results from the Digital News Report managed by the University of Oxford. This is an annual and representative survey asking for concerns about fake news in 40 countries. There are big differences in the fear of fake news between Brazil on the left and the Netherlands on the right. On average, 56%, more than half of internet users in a country have such concerns. Especially politicians and social media are seen as the most important source of these fake news. And here's another chart. As a proxy for public interest in fake news, I use here the number of searches in Google. This is a diagram from Google Trends, which shows that the number of searches grew in the last month of 2016, in the time of the US election, and peaked in March 2020 when the pandemic started. Science also deals with the crisis. In recent years, we have witnessed a tremendous increase in research activities on many aspects and in various disciplines, in social sciences, humanities, and computer science. For example, there's a large body of empirical studies on disinformation, on aspects like diffusion, the intents and strategies to create and share them, the effects of disinformation, and how to debunk them. As a rough estimation, this is really not an exact measure and not a complete measure. As a rough estimation of research activities, I chose the number of hits for the phrase fake news in Google Scholar, the search engine for scientific sources. A hit represents more or less a publication. For the year 2010, Google Scholar counts 375 hits. The number jumps up to 1,510 hits in 2016, 10,900 hits in 2017, and for the last year, 2020, Google Scholar counts 27,600 publications. Now, the thesis of my presentation is current debates and awareness about critical developments in the media and in public discourse, such as fake news, alternative facts, post-truth politics, highlight processes of change in the knowledge order in modern societies, especially in liberal democracies. The question of who can legitimately claim knowledge, truth, and trust in public discourse, and based on which practices, has become an object of heated disputes. Oftentimes, these disputes bring up pointed criticisms of traditional epistemic authorities, such as journalism and science. Yes, there are a number of explanations for this crisis, such as political, think about populism, economic inequality, and cultural factors. In my presentation, I will focus on media change and digitalization. Digitalization used to be associated with, at least in the beginning, with high expectations regarding the quality of knowledge and public access to knowledge. Today, however, the discussion is dominated by a more negative view. In the next part of my presentation, I will propose a model of knowledge order as a theoretical framework in order to get a deeper understanding of the crisis. One purpose of this framework is also to integrate the very fragmented research landscape. In the third and main part, I will apply this model to analyze the change of knowledge order. The main focus of my presentation will be the role of media and journalism. And then in the final part, I will evaluate these changes and ask for ways to overcome the crisis. Now, let's start. What do I mean by knowledge order? I follow the definition given by Helmut Spinner, a German sociologist. He defines the knowledge order of society as a fundamental order of knowledge which specifies the constitutive presuppositions, internal regulations, and external conditions for the production, application, distribution, administration, implementation, utilization, etc. of knowledge in society. This order applies to all knowledge types and degrees of quality of this knowledge. Besides knowledge order, you can find in the literature other labels for these knowledge-related structures of society, for example, knowledge economy or knowledge system, knowledge cultures, and knowledge regimes. My model has references to several fields of research, which I cannot elaborate in detail here. It has references to social epistemology. This is a field of philosophy which analyzes the epistemic practices in social conditions for the application of these practices. And the core of this approach is practices. Arvin Goldman says, I cite him here, I quote him here, which practices have a comparatively favorable impact on knowledge as contrasted with error and ignorance. That's the main question of social epistemology. The model also refers to the sociology of knowledge. Here I follow Berger-Luckmann and Foucault, which adds aspects as the division of knowledge and questions of power. Important approaches are also knowledge history and media history. We can learn from history that the current crisis is typical for the invention of new media. An example are the aftermath of the printing press in the 15th century and the following centuries. I discussed and developed this model together with my colleagues Anne Bartsch from the University of Leipzig, Romy Fröhlich, Thomas Hanitsch, Carsten Reinemann, and Johanna Schindler, all from the LMU Munich, from the University of Munich. We already published one paper, another is under review at the moment. Now, what are the elements of the knowledge order? I distinguish 4 elements. The first one is the knowledge process. Here we look at the practices for the generation, verification, distribution, and appropriation of knowledge and the order of these steps. The second element are the roles in the knowledge process. The people who act as producers, reviewers, media distributors, and the audience members. Thirdly, we have several contexts of knowledge with differing standards, practices, and purposes. For example, science, journalism, politics, and the everyday life. Finally, there is more or less a hierarchy of knowledge context in the so-called knowledge society. Science claims the highest authority. The phases of the knowledge process can be categorized in different ways. What you can see here is a rather simple model with 4 stages, which are similar in science and journalism. The generation of knowledge, the phase of research and investigation, its verification, peer review and gatekeeping, the distribution by media, and the appropriation of knowledge, that is the reception of media content and the discourse that follows. Each step can be assigned practices, for example, research methods, peer review, or discursive rules in science, or practices in journalism like cross-verification and source transparency. Carrying out these practices is intended to guarantee rationality in the process. Now, how did the knowledge process change? We start with a look at the knowledge order under the conditions of traditional mass media, like newspapers, magazines, radio, and televisions. 2 characteristics are important. There's a clear separation of roles in this linear knowledge process. Journalists have the central role as gatekeepers. They collect, select, verify, and write the news. Sources and the audience are not part of the news production. And the second important point is that all this happens behind closed doors in the newsroom. That means it is not very transparent how journalists work. The audience keeps rather passive and consumes mainly. It can only criticize knowledge claims after publication via letters to the editor. Now, this changes on the internet. The linear pipeline logic of the mass media is partly replaced by a platform logic. Platforms are areas of participation and interaction driven by algorithms. That means that the people formerly known as the audience, I quote here the famous phrase from J. Rosen, can expand their activities and adopt additional roles. They can publish their own everyday knowledge and eyewitness reports on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And they are no longer the silent recipients of journalism, but they can online comment, give feedback, and discuss the news. As citizen journalists, users can even participate in journalism. The role of the producer and the role of the user are mixed to the hybrid role of the so-called producer. Axel Bruns coined this term. Not only the audience, but also the sources and spokespersons can adopt new roles. For example, politicians as Donald Trump and PR people working for companies. They can bypass the journalistic quality control and publish their messages without obstacles. This contributes to diversity on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also allows the unfiltered spread of disinformation. Stakeholders from economy and politics also often imitate journalism in order to profit from its credibility. That is what I call pseudo-journalism. That is the field of alternative media, as Breitbart.com, influencers, content marketing, and native advertising. That is all content with an unclear identity between propaganda, advertising, and journalism. In addition, these stakeholders employ special techniques of dissemination like micro-targeting and social bots, and techniques of observation, social media monitoring, and data analysis. Now, to sum it up, access to roles becomes easier, flexibility increases. This also applies to the order of the stages. Often there's no checking or only after publication. This is a different view of the knowledge order. Here we can see the different knowledge contexts like science, politics, and economy. It's similar to the institutional model, which showed us Doña Alineat tomorrow in the morning in the first keynote of our conference. In the era of mass media, journalism had the important function to integrate these fragmented knowledge areas and to intermediate between them and the audience. As a trusted intermediary, journalism is meant to guarantee the trustful content of knowledge to the audience, as it has verified the knowledge obtained from speakers and other sources. In the hybrid public of the internet, lay rationality, scientific and other professional rationalities are no longer clearly separated or bridged by journalism. That means, for example, the disinformation campaigns can be conducted unhindered. The consequences of this collapse of context is a certain disorientation of the audience regarding the journalistic identity and trustworthiness of digital content. Here, platforms replace in part journalism as an intermediary, but without curating the content. More and more people use social media as a news source, especially in the younger generation. Old media are gradually being displaced according to the digital news report. At the same time, however, social media contribute to the participation and empowerment of the citizens. Now, another consequence of the digital transformation is the questioning of epistemic authorities. The so-called alternative media often criticize legacy media as biased, partisan, deceitful, and distant from ordinary people, as part of a powerful elite and a conspiracy against the people. In Germany, for example, we had loud protests against the so-called lying press, die Lügenpresse. But the question is how relevant and influential is this criticism of the media? Have the media really lost a great deal of trust, as is repeatedly claimed? Longitudinal studies show that there's no universal trend. As in some countries media lose trust, in others the share stagnates. Especially in stable democracies, media do not lose trust, with exceptions like the US and the UK. Media more often lose trust in transforming countries which are in the process of democratizing. In Germany, a polarization could be observed since 2015. The share of very high and very low trustworthiness is growing, while the medium level shrinks. This can be explained by the fact that people stimulated by criticism of the media are thinking more about the trustworthiness and taking a clearer position. This chart from the digital news report shows the trust in science, health organizations, and media while the corona pandemic. It demonstrates, I think, clearly that at least in such a crisis, trust in epistemic authorities is still very high. These are results from 6 countries: US, UK, Germany, Spain, Argentina, and South Korea. Scientists and doctors have the top positions, followed by health and news organizations. The least trusted source of information is social media. Now, let me sum up. I wanted to provide a better understanding of the current debates on the epistemic crisis. We are witnessing in the digital public sphere a dissolution of the order of phases in the knowledge process. The motto is often publish first, then verify. Professional roles and phases of the knowledge process are being opened up to new actors. We witness a role flexibilization. We see in part a collapse of contexts, the dissolution of boundaries. And we see the questioning of established epistemic authorities, a lot of public criticism, but not a great loss of confidence. Interestingly, we can observe similar phenomena as in journalism and in the media in the realm of science. Think, for example, of preprints. That means papers published before review. think of citizen science, which mixes the roles of citizen and scientists. It's similar as the citizen journalist, which mixes also the role of citizen and the role of the journalist. Think of hybridization of knowledge work. Who is, for example, editing and writing for the Wikipedia? Scientists, layperson, or also propagandists? And think of criticism of science. Now I come to the final remarks of my presentation and finish with a few concluding points. My first point is, are we living in a post-factual age? I would say, and maybe most of you would also say no. The answer is no. The old knowledge order and the old mass media still exist and still dominate. We are living in a hybrid media system with different logics, old media logics and the digital logic. We don't see a linear and encompassing trend. We can observe counterforces to preserve the quality of public communication, for example, fact-checking and debunking projects. Things are also sometimes not as bad as it is assumed. A number of studies conclude that the reach and the impact of the fake news are overestimated if we compare it with the total volume of the media news. The epistemic crisis has been stimulating public reflection on truth, knowledge, and trust. This can be seen as a chance to intentionally create better epistemic practices, including, for example, more transparency, more participation, more diversity, and better deliberation. What is needed in this situation is a more experimental approach, following John Dewey and his concept of experimental democracy, or Karl Popper and his idea of piecemeal technology. The new opportunities for individual users are accompanied by a new responsibility for producing, verifying, and distributing knowledge. This requires better media literacy. Another question is what needs to be done to ensure that platforms take responsibility for the common good. That was a point which was also debated from Honora O'Neill in her keynote. And finally, we have to ask, how can professional journalism survive when it is becoming increasingly difficult to make money with news? But these are questions that need to be answered, I think, in another lecture. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph, for raising such a bunch of questions, very interesting questions, very intriguing questions, and probably some of them are very difficult to answer, or at least we can, jointly try to find some answers to the questions that you raised. I would like to, I already see a couple of questions in the Q&A, but, and those are also, people who acclaim your lectures, so I will come to them shortly. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. But I would like to start off with one question that occurred to me. At the end of your talk, you talk about the responsibility of several actors, several parties to this problem, to solve this problem. What is the responsibility of governments in governing this new knowledge order? You have raised the question of who is responsible in terms of companies. What are the companies supposed to do? What are the mass media? What kind of responsibilities do they have? You've also raised the question of citizens, but what exactly do you think could be the responsibility of governments, particularly in those democratic societies that are stable and which should remain stable? What is their responsibilities, for instance, in terms of regulating or in terms of governing the different actors and how they can keep that balance?
Yes, that is a very important questions, and I didn't add the governance to my list. I only said something about the individual users and also about journalism and the platforms. And I think we have here shared responsibility for all these problems I mentioned. And And we had also a big debate here in Germany about the regulation. Think about the so-called Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz for the platforms, which gives the duty to the platform companies to check the content which is published on their platforms, and they have to delete these problematic content. I think it should really be a shared responsibility, what means that all actors should work together at this point. It should not be alone a duty for the governance to make regulation. And I think it's also not only the question of regulation, it's also a question of incentives, of creating of alternatives. For example, you know that because you wrote a book about that, about the European media platform, that's a great vision. We are debating about that for a few years now. I think it was Ulrich Wilhelm, the director of the Bavarian public service broadcasting company, who had this idea, and that is really a big vision. But I think it's a right way, in my opinion, because it's not only important to regulate the US platforms, but it's also important to create alternatives, to create Dutch alternatives which realize these European values. I think that's also a very important role of governance.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we may come back to that particularly that European perspectives on the governance of platforms. I have a few questions in the Q&A that ask you about the importance of AI-generated contents, the contents that is generated by algorithms and artificial intelligence. How would you count that into your new knowledge order? Can you respond to that?
I think I used the word algorithm only one time, and I saw that when I read this in the afternoon. And yes, it's true. I mentioned, or I gave the emphasis to the citizens and the role of citizens and other actors, human actors in society, and the role of AI is absolutely growing, and it's important to also reflect on the role of AI. But behind the AI is always a human being, the one who writes the code of this AI. And this leads us to the debate about also algorithms which are not only coded for commercialization and for control or filtering, but also to fulfill normative values like, for example, diversity. That is also a very important point, I think, for algorithms, because of the big amount of content on the internet that can't do journalists. They can't select, and they can't give a complete overview of what is happening on the internet. So it's very important to have the help of AI.
Yeah, actually, this question was asked by Matteo Nicolosi, who also asked a follow-up question. I think the two are related, but can the fact that it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish automatically generated contents, can that change the framework that your studies highlighted? You know, the framework that you just showcased?
Yes, I should add, I think, in the next version of the model also, besides the role of the citizens and the role of the PR people and the spokespersons, I should reflect, but I don't follow the actor network theory that it's an own role. It's more something, let's say, which helps the actors in their interests, I think, and I should add it to the human roles of citizens and spokespersons, I think. But that's a good idea. Thank you.
So there you also have a suggestion for how to adjust the scheme that you just showed. There's another question asked by David Dyer Lawson, and he wonders whether post-factualism, as you just described it, particularly in the US, is that on the decline after the electoral failure of Donald Trump in the US? Can you comment on that one?
I think there are many differences between the countries. It might decline in the US, but we see here in Europe, and because of the COVID pandemic, there's a lot of, for example, in Germany and other European countries, there's a lot of fake news and conspiracy theories, and I think it has. It depends on the events and the topics which are debated in the public spheres, and I think it's more. I think we have to differentiate more than before between the situation in the different countries, I'd say.
So do you think there's a different trajectory in terms of post-factualism or post-truth, as we call it, between the US and Europe? Do you see a different line of investigation, or do you see a different response from governments in the two continents?
I'm not an expert for law and governance, but when I look in journalism, I think the professional norms of the US journalism are also used here in Germany. That means the media in Germany follow what's happening in the US, and they see what is debated there, and how they handle these problems, and they learn a lot about the things which happen there in the US. And but I think there are absolutely national differences also in the amount of fake news and conspiracy theories, I'd say.
Yeah, there's also a question from Theophanis Varvoglis, and I think I'll try to summarize that question as there's a number of new sort of type of virtual reality creation software, creative software, like which can create deep fake news, for instance. Do you see that as an important trend in shaping, the kind of fake news that we're witnessing right now?
Yes, I think journalism has to adjust its practices. I think that there are different fields where they have to adjust these practices. For example, for artificial intelligence or for deep fakes, for these fake visuals, that is also an important point. But there are also other fields where they have to adjust the practices. And I think there's already much reflection about these questions in the journalistic professions. And yes.
Okay, there's a couple more questions in the Q&A, and please feel free to add more. I think we'll have some 10 more minutes for you to give some answers. So please feel free to put that in the Q&A. There's a question here from Per Wolf. I can't see where he's from, but he says, thanks for the great keynote. And he has two questions. First, what links do you see to other societal phenomena, such as effective polarization, also known as the culture wars within the public, leading to the use of different mainstream versus alternative media, the alternative media you just discussed? And his second question is, how do you look at current regulation initiatives on the EU level? We actually just talked a little bit about that but let me first stick to the first one, because I think you addressed that in terms of the mainstream versus alternative media.
Yes, at the beginning of my presentation, I said there are several explanations for these developments, for this crisis. There are political, economic, and cultural factors, which are also very important, and they also work together, I think, these different factors, like populism, alternative media, and the opportunities which social media give for their mobilization and their propaganda. That means that you can't isolate one of these factors. That's absolutely correct, I think. Okay, and the EU.
Yeah, the second one is actually maybe you, because you didn't really comment on governance issues, and because that wasn't actually part of your talk, but how do you look at the current regulation initiatives on the EU level with regard to big tech? And I'm mainly thinking about the Digital Service Act and the DMA. And while I'm asking this question, I would like to also announce tomorrow morning's lecture, starting at 12 noon, will be about governance. So those of you who are particularly interested in the governance perspective in Europe should also join our meeting tomorrow morning. Would you like to respond to that question, or would you rather leave it to Natalie Hellberger tomorrow?
That's wonderful. Maybe Natalie Hellberger is the expert for these questions, for these governance questions on the EU level. I think it has absolutely great importance to find here ways of regulations, and to find, especially for transparency and to avoid discrimination, that are very important points for the public discourse and for the liberal democracy. And I think this should be the important points for this regulation also on the EU level, I would say.
Yeah, so we'll leave the rest of that intriguing topic for Natalie tomorrow morning.
Yes.
There's a few more questions on polarization, because many of the sessions this afternoon were about, misinformation and polarization. This is Brandy Morris asking a question. Current public discourses and polarization on issues where there is a scientific consensus calls into question the claim that we do not live in a post-factual world. Do you really think that fact-checkers can outrun the nefarious forces working to spread disinformation? What is the role of fact-checkers?
I think they are very important, and there are a lot of initiatives of fact-checking, and it's a new role for journalism. But there's also the question who pays for fact-checking, because it's not producing news. That means you have a newspaper edition which you can sell, and the question is, and it was the last point of my presentation, who will pay in the future for these journalistic performances, and what is really necessary for the digital public spheres, fact-checking, but also you mentioned polarization. Who will be the moderators of these deliberative forums we need, and we don't have. We only have this rough debates on the platforms, and we need forums where you can really debate with respect, rationality, and so on, all the things Jürgen Habermas was writing in his book about public sphere. And we don't have these places, and that brings us back to the vision of a European media platform where all these things should happen.
Yeah, I think we could talk for at least another afternoon about, the uses of fact-checking and who's going to pay for them, because that is an intriguing question indeed. Now, there's another question asked by Glenn Anderow, if I pronounced that correctly, and that is, can the transformation of the knowledge order, as you just explained it, caused by the internet and social media, have positive consequences?
Yes.
Could one argue that it leads to a democratization of journalism and the knowledge order in general?
Yes.
And then it goes on to mention like projects such as Wikipedia. Should we focus on how the internet can actually impact changes in the knowledge order positively?
Yes, yes. Maybe it was a bit too negative, because I started with the crisis of knowledge order, and most examples I gave were negative examples. But that should not be the impression I wanted to give you, because the internet or the digital media are much more than the older media are able to open for designing, and it's more the question of what we want and how to design this medium, but that means also that we have to find the right formats, and we have neither resources also for create better platforms and better forms of deliberation and knowledge production and knowledge verification. I think the internet is still not in its final state, and that means we can be optimistic, and we just have to find the right ways with regulation, but also to designing the right formats.
Well, thank you. That, this is another really huge question, which we should take at least an hour more to discuss. There's a couple of more questions. One comes from Carla Pavel, and it reads, on your last slide in your presentation, you suggested that better epistemic practices. What do you think they might look like? You mentioned more transparency, but are there more aspects? And yes. How do you tell truth from non-truth from a sociology of knowledge perspective? And the final adding to that is, could you recommend literature? That would probably be a long list, but could you give a suggestion as to how to move forwards?
Yes, which I said in the beginning that I follow the social epistemology, Alvin Goldman, and he follows a veristic approach which takes a middle position between an extreme skepticism on the one side, relativism, constructivism, and on which denies any access to reality, and a naive everyday realism on the other hand, that has no doubts about the attainability of truth. That means the social epistemology is more or less in the between these extreme positions in epistemic debates, and drawing the social epistemology had a weaker understanding of truth. It acknowledges these doubts about truth, and looks for justifications with good reasons, and accepts evidence, at least provisionally. And that means that knowledge claims must be justified and are always open for further questioning. That's more or less the position of social epistemology. And the question was how we can improve the practices, epistemic practices. I think we don't have to innovate or find absolutely new practices. I think we should use the potential of the technical potential of the internet to improve practices. For example, transparency, that you can show all the sources you use when you are writing an article in journalism, for example, or that you can get the corrections of the audience if you made a mistake. That was not so easy as in earlier times for newspapers, that you can correct the articles in real time if you made a mistake. All these changes can happen in the digital journalism and should be done.
Okay, thanks. There's actually quite a few more questions in the Q&A, but I would like to mention one that was raised actually as one of the first ones. It's a short question, but it's asked by Bernie McMahon, sorry. Is there a difference in how this crisis is happening between collectivist and individualist cultures?
Oh, that's really complicated. I don't have the data and the comparison for these different cultures. It's not so easy to answer these questions. Maybe the symptoms of the crisis and the mood and the impression that it's really a crisis is more, you can find more in liberal democracies and in the individual cultures, and not so much in collective cultures. Yes.
Okay, well, I think we need to move on to the last question of this afternoon. And for those of you who still want to stay in the Q&A and ask more questions, we can stay here for a little bit, and perhaps Christoph can answer a couple more in the Q&A. This is the last question I would like to pose to you. The modality of citizen science and engagement of citizens in knowledge generation has gained great political momentum, particularly in Europe. What would be your caveats about this trend in the context of digital transformation that you discussed?
It was about citizen science. I was talking about citizen journalism, but I think also citizen science is very important. But there are different ways how to handle this. Critics say citizen science is sometimes only cheap labor for science, or it's just advertising for science and not real science, what happens in these projects. And it's, I think, really important that people, the citizens who engage in these projects, get really insight and a look inside science and learn more about how science works and how the practices are in science, and learn more about science.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we need to wrap up here. It's a little